Back in the 1980s, I had a friend who ran a company called Novagen, whose name was Bruce Jordan, and I used to call him up and bug him about the games that they were making and ask questions and stuff. And I ended up helping come up with some designs for a game that they were doing at Novagen, just simple things like objects that you could put into the world of the game that they were making, which was called Mercenary 3, I think. And I was also a programmer. I programmed at home. And um, after I finished school, I really wanted to get into the games industry. So I applied for different jobs near where I was living, which was just outside of London. And I got offered two jobs, one of which was a junior programmer job at Bullfrog back then, and the other was a production assistant job at a place called Grand Slam, which was a publisher. And I kind of thought about it, and I wasn't that great of a programmer, so I was kind of thinking they're going to figure that out. And Grand Slam offered me more money to. I wasn't earning a lot of money; it was very little, and the little bit extra that they were offering me was a big deal back then. So I took that job instead, and I was just working for a publisher doing product acquisition and testing, and publishing, putting things in a box and selling it essentially. Well, we were very small. There was just two of us in the department. There was my boss, Paul, and at the beginning anyway, and me. And the company had been a lot bigger, and then it had financial problems and kind of downsized. So it was just him and I. But initially it was back. I was so into video games and so in love with them, and such a gamer and an enthusiast that just doing anything in the industry was awesome. So I was super enthusiastic about it and loved everything about it. But it became clear very quickly. We were a small company. We didn't have a lot of money, and that the limitations of that became clear pretty quickly. So we had to be very sort of creative in terms of who we worked with and what we worked on. But it was a lot of fun, and getting to meet all these people that had been, I used to read all the computer magazines, and I had people that I was real big fans of, and I started to meet them, and it was just such a real big thrill to meet these people that you kind of, idolized is probably the wrong word, but people that you respected, and just find out that most of them were just normal, nice people, and doing a job just like you were kind of doing a job. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot of stuff really, really quickly because we were so small. We grew a little bit bigger. We had a guy come in to do sales, and we had a couple of other kind of producers and people join the company over the next few years. But I got to learn a lot about how to, the whole process of getting a game signed up and produced and then put in a box and on a shelf. Grand Slam had a history of licensing IP. So the guy who ran Grand Slam was a guy called Stephen Hall, and he had worked in television. So he had a relationship with various IP holders and license holders. And so we would have different types of game. We would do a game like Nick Faldo's Golf, which is one of the first games I worked on, where the company had the license to make a Nick Faldo game, and we would go and find a developer who could do that game. So we would go and go around the people we knew in the industry and just start meeting people and saying, we have these licenses, would you like to work on that license, and pick somebody who we thought could do a good job for the budget that we had. And sometimes the opposite was true. We would have people pitch games to us and who needed a publisher and needed funding, and we would the ones we liked, and the ones we could afford, we would work on. And the games in Hungary are a good example of that. We would meet people at trade shows. A lot of the time, we always went to trade shows. We always had a stand, and there was a constant stream of people back then, because anybody could be a game developer back then, and be if you had the talent, you could have 2 or 3, 5 people maybe in a room and make an Amiga game. So a lot of people would come to trade shows with a disc, and we would put it in our Amiga or our PC, and look at the stuff they were working on, and the ones that had some potential, we would contact them after the show and work on try and do a deal and make a game with those guys. So it just depended, but those were the two main ways that we would get something. Occasionally, someone would come up with a completely finished game, and they would be, "This is done," and we just want to sell it to you. I remember one of those was a game by a guy called Stavros Vassoulis, who was a very, very successful Commodore 64 programmer who did games like Sanction and Delta. And he had this game called Galactic, which was an amazing Amiga game. And we put it on our stand at the show. He had a disc, and it was just people queuing to play it because it was so well done. It used all the technology in the Amiga very cleverly. So lots of sprites on screen, lots of color. But he wanted a figure for it, which seemed reasonable to me, but I couldn't persuade the management to buy that game. And the game never ever came out. There was a demo of it released on a magazine once, and that's it. And it's one of those lost games that it's never come out in its entirety, which is a shame. But yeah, so those are the ways that we usually went about procuring games back then. Now it's probably easier if you're a guy or a team who wants to put something out. In theory, you can do that on your own, right? You don't need anybody else. And if you have a game that's really good, like Stardew Valley or something like that, you can be very, very successful. Or even if you're not interested in being very successful, and you just want to put stuff out and get feedback from people, it's easy now because of the internet and because of these different stores in which you can place things for very little money. What was easier back then, I think, was it was easier to make a game because the machines were easier. I mean, you probably needed a higher level of skill to be able to get started because you still had to work in assembler language, or some games were written in C, but anything that was fast on an Amiga or even an 8-bit computer, was what we were working on when we started, was always an assembler. So you needed to be a little bit more technical maybe than you do right now to get something going, but it was faster to finish something. You could do a competitive AAA game in 3 to 6 months, depending on who you were. So that bit was easier, and selling things was easier in the respect that stores only had a limited amount of shelf space. So if you had a good product and you had a good marketing budget, you could pretty much figure out how many you were going to be able to push through sales channels. There was always some variance, but it was a lot more controlled than it is right now. And in some respects, that made it easier to know what you were going to get back. It was a little bit more predictable, I think. I think it's still probably true for some of the bigger. If you're a very big publisher now, you still have a pretty good idea of what you're going to be able to push through a channel. But if you're a smaller guy, and you don't have the biggest marketing budget, I'm not sure. You could put something out and it could sell nothing. It could be an awesome game and it could sell nothing. But at least you could put it out today, whereas back then you had to really find a publisher. And then you knew that you would be able to do a few thousand units of almost anything back then. You could, we put out some really poor things and we still managed to make money on them sometimes because you knew how the retail channel worked, and it was the only one that existed. So it was easier to control it from that respect. So I think it's pros and cons. But certainly, I think the quality of games these days, in terms of, I can't remember the last time I picked up something that was just awful and played it. There's a certain quality bar, I think, that everyone's got to. Whereas back then, you really could go in a store and buy a game for £20 or £10, and it could be awful, like just really bad, because people would just put rubbish up. I don't. That doesn't seem to happen so much now. If you go into a store and buy a game, they're usually at a fairly high quality level. If you download something from the App Store, then it could be anything, right? But I'm a retro kind of guy. I really liked it when iPhone came out, and it kind of felt a little bit like the old days again. You could have smaller teams. You could work on things that you didn't need to have, a ton of content, expensive content, to be competitive and make money. You could release quirky little things, and that kind of PC. That market's kind of gone on now into PC a lot more, and with Steam and things like that, where you can have indie games that are relatively inexpensive to make and yet be very successful, and they're high quality, but they don't necessarily have the same production cost as a AAA console game. And I think that's awesome that you can do that. The most games I have the most fun with are those type of games these days. I play those a lot. So I think it's a lot more complex now. If you're making a big console title or a big PC title, there's a lot more people involved, so that makes it inherently more complex to get stuff done, because you just have to organize a lot more people, and the games are now more of a service. These things live for years. So you put a game out and you're updating it, you're doing DLC. If you're doing an MMO or an online game, it's live, and you're having to do live operations on that game. That was just stuff that we didn't even think about back then. You put it in a box and it was gone, and you never even thought. Unless there was a patch in case if you'd made a mistake or something, or a bug. But most of the time you just released the game and forgot about it and got on with the next one. So you have to have a different mindset when you're dealing with things that have a longer shelf life than they used to, or you're updating all the time. I think back then, one of the problems was the number of really good developers was small. So there were lots of people that could kind of hack something together, but having a really good team of people that could reliably produce stuff was finding those guys was hard. There weren't that many of them, and there's still probably not that many of them. But that was one of the problems that you faced, was just if you really wanted to do something good, you had to find really, really, really good people. Whereas now you can have a team of 100 people, and it's a different problem. Back then you had to have 3 or 4 really, really awesome people. And if you have a team of 100 people, there's kind of mixtures of different people in that team, and it's more about having good visionaries that are driving it forward, and good practices and stuff like that, rather than just having a couple of really good people on it and get on with it. The management of that process is much more complicated now, of making something different, much longer development times. So, the longest game that I ever did on the Amiga probably took 9 months to make, or something like that, and now it's 3 years, to make something. So, and then you support it for another 3 years. So, it's a different process, and requires different skills. Different management skills, and different ways of organizing the team so that they're effective. A lot of games back then came from someone figuring out a cool routine. So, I don't know, the golf game that we worked on, there was the reason we picked the developer for that was they had a cool 3D routine that made terrain. and they were going to they could use it for something else. But we were like, oh, you could do a golf game with that, or the NovaGen games came from having a fast vector graphics rendering routine, and then it's, well, what can we do with that? Whereas nowadays, the design is more, well, we know that we can do almost anything in terms of a visual. You're not dependent on some one individual creating a fast routine to do something. It's more of what do we want to make, and you come at it from a more of a design perspective of what do we want to build rather than what can we build. And the design of stuff is, I think it's a lot more sort of genre led these days. So it would be what kind of games are selling well, what do we think is going to be selling well in a few years, what already exists, who are you competing against, and can you compete against them in an effective way? So you have to kind of think about that. Whereas we didn't really think about that too much back in the day. Maybe we should have done. I don't know, but it's also a little bit soulless, right? There's something cool about just going, we're going to do this and it's going to be awesome, and not worrying about everyone else. But if you're spending $100 million on a game, you have to know that you can make the money back. So I think a lot of genre, the designs of things have not necessarily got more complex in some respects, from a real basic level, but the amount of content you have to make and the different kind of modes and things you have to put in, all the online components, make it inherently more complex to do something than it was before. So if you did a first-person shoot 'em up, the sort of gameplay is very similar. I mean, you move the mouse around and you click a button and you shoot a bullet and the guy dies. The presentation is years ahead, but the actual game design, if you wrote it down on a piece of paper, could actually be very similar, I think, in some respects. And then other genres of game that didn't even exist back then have evolved. Like there were online games, but nothing like a World of Warcraft or an EverQuest or an Ultima Online, any of the any Destiny, anything like that just wasn't even possible back then. So those are more recent kind of developments, and they have different design requirements from other types of games and different core loops, and then mobile games. The successful mobile games, the design behind those is very different in terms of getting people, to start playing and staying with the game, and spending money as quickly as possible after you've given them the game for free. It requires a different design sensibility from building a game where you go in a store and pay $60 for it, and different ways of hooking people into the game. So it depends on what you're making and what your platform is, but I think some things carry over. A good game is still a good game. I can still play sensible soccer. I still do play sensible soccer with my kids, and it's still a fun game. And it's better than most of the modern football games from a gameplay perspective, in my opinion. But it looks terrible compared to them. But it has an immediacy and an easy to learn control system and super fast responses. So for me, that's actually a superior design to a modern soccer game where everything's motion captured and you kick a ball and it takes half a second for the guy to decide which animation to play to kick it, and it's a lot slower. I think it was a lot easier to have original ideas back then, or at least things that were more original than they are now. Because we're a lot further, along in terms of the development of the industry, and certain things have stratified into, genres or whatever. So you could normally tell back then. You could, a lot of the time with most of the stuff, if you had a cool routine, and a cool graphics artist who could draw good art, and a cool programmer who could code fast stuff. You know, you knew that if you had a good basic idea for something and it just resonated with you and it felt cool, that you would probably be able to execute something that was cool. And you know, a lot of the time it didn't quite live up to what you originally thought, or sometimes it exceeded it. But you know, it was you could define something on a lot quicker. I think that you would be able to go, yeah, that's going to be awesome, because the overall development time for these things, like I said, was only a few months most of the time. So you had a pretty good idea very quickly if you had the core of something that was going to work. Now it takes 6 months just to do a prototype of something, right? You know, and what we do is we call them vertical slices, where it looks like a finished game, but there's a narrow. It's just very limited in scope, so it might be a 5 or 10 minute experience, and that can take months and months, a year, to make something like that. And I don't think you really know until you've got something like that, if you have anything, because it's so dependent on, you know, you can have fun with blocks that don't look like anything, but until you really see how it's going to look as a finished thing, and it sounds like it's going to look as a finished thing, and it plays like it's a finished thing, which is dependent on how it looks and how it sounds so much more than it used to be in terms of, you know, defining its quality. You know, because, you know, having a character that's really compelling, that's responding to you through animation and sound, or the way your guy moves, is really important these days to, you know, the quality of the game, and the experience of the player. That is, you have to have a lot of stuff created just to be able to get that, to understand if it works. So I think it takes a lot longer these days to, and just a piece of, if you can have a cool idea on a piece of paper. Most people think game designs are stories, but, you know, it's not that hard to come up with a reasonably compelling story. But a game is about feel, and about how do things move, and about responsiveness, or you know, how do you get led through the experience? What are you doing? What are those core loops that keep you engaged after 5 seconds and 20 seconds and a minute? And you can't put that on paper. You have to build it, right? And that's the skill. And that's why not everybody can do it, because it requires a lot of effort from lots of people and someone who has a vision to be able to bring that in and then make it compelling and fun over, you know, 5 seconds, 20 seconds, a minute, an hour, a day, or whatever, right? So you keep coming back to it and you're engaged. And I think that these days you have to be able to build a lot more of the game to be able to understand if you've got something that's really working, compared to back in the day. You could have a piece of paper and a good routine and some nice pieces of artwork, that, you know, I mean, also the artwork back then was, you know, mostly 2D and mostly hand drawn. So you could have a couple of pieces of concept work, and you could pretty much figure out that was what it was going to look like on screen. But today it's more complex than that. You know, it takes a lot more time to get to that point where you go, yeah, that's cool. We have something that works, and paper is not enough. Paper can just get you excited, but, you know, you could write the best game in the world on paper, and if you can't execute it, and it's not fun when you execute it, it doesn't matter. So you have to build it, and it takes time. You have to be prepared to throw away what you've built too, which is terrifying. You know, you've just spent $5 million or something, and you throw it away. But if it's not working at that point, and you don't understand why, you can spend a lot more and end up with something that's terrible. You know, so it's the first rule of marketing. Like, people buy what they know. So, and if you're spending a lot of money on making something, you want to know that you're going to be able to you have a good chance of getting that money back. So the sequel is a safer bet in some respects because you know you have a built-in audience, and if you execute a sequel that's as good as or better than the previous one, a lot of people are going to be interested in it. In theory, the problem with that is that in the end, I think people generally get tired of sequels, especially if they're released too close to each other. Um, I think sports games are immune from that. So I think you can release Madden every year or FIFA every year because there's always new players and people moving between teams, and it's a different user expectation, and I want to buy a game that has the updated guys in it or whatever. But I think if Nintendo released a new Zelda game every year, after a while I think it might hurt them rather than be a good thing, because there's an expectation. People you know people look forward to it if it's a little bit longer. They kind of get sick of things if you're constantly being bombarded with new games that are basically the same. And it takes time to come up with something new and interesting. It's hard to keep making something that's very different or unique in a short space of time. So the sequels tend to be very similar to each other in terms of gameplay if you release them too close together. So ideally, you have a good sequel to something, and you're improving you're making changes to the gameplay, but it's set in the same world or the characters that people like, and that's how you innovate. You try and innovate. You innovate maybe more on adding new game features and gameplay ideas in to an IP that people already know. So you have the best of both worlds. It's something that people know, but you're introducing new stuff. And I think that's one of the things that Nintendo does very well with their IP, like Mario and Zelda. The games, they're instantly recognizable as a sequel, but they always have some new mechanic or new way of playing the game there that's really compelling and interesting. Whereas I'm not sure you could say the same for a lot of other people that release sequels. But it is very hard to take a risk, and if you are trying to make something that's a AAA kind of quality game that's going to cost a lot of money, you don't know if it's going to sell if it's a new IP. You could make a really awesome game, but it just might not. It might not sell because people just don't take to it for whatever reason. And and then if you're doing something even more out there in terms of the gameplay and something that people aren't familiar with, it is a risk. I mean, you could have the next big thing. I mean, that's the possibility, right? You could make that new thing that's just so awesome that everybody has to play it. But it's very hard to sell someone that on paper. You have to build it, which goes back to the previous comment, right? So, but yeah, I know I get bored of sequels, and I'm not going to name anything that's negative, but latest version of this shooter game, and you're playing it, and it's like I literally have played this game 10 years ago, and you've just got prettier graphics, and different sounds. But there's not much new in here or anything to get excited about. It's if I really like that kind of thing, it's just more of that kind of thing, and that's fine for some people. But one of the good things about the games industry in the earlier days was people could do really off the wall new ideas because it only cost a few $1,000 to make something. So you'd wasted 3 to 6 months of time, or not wasted, but you'd invested that, and you could just start again and do something else very quickly. But that doesn't necessarily work these days. If you have to start again, you've wasted a large amount of money. There's lots of things. So the first thing is have what I call demonstrable enthusiasm. So that means actually make something. You know, you know, everybody thinks they are a game designer. Um, so if you want to be a game designer, make a game, make a board game, get Unity or get Unreal and make a level. Right? There's all these tools out there now that you can use to make something that really shows you're serious about what you want to do, and you're not just talking about it. So demonstrably show me that you're enthusiastic by actually building something. Go to school, go to a college that has a game programming or a game design course, and be involved and make something with other people. That's what all these places do. All the schools now, if there is one near you or wherever you're at, you can go to school and learn this, and you end up building a project as part of the course. Go to the local IGDA chapter or the local game developer meeting. There's usually one in every big city somewhere where there's more than a few game developers. Go to GDC. Go to wherever they're all over the world now. There's one in every continent. Show that you're enthusiastic. Make things. And network. Find people on LinkedIn or Facebook who you like and contact them and just make yourself known. I get people all the time contacting me on LinkedIn in particular, and I always respond, and if they have a question, I'll always answer it if they're polite. And I know a lot of other people do that too. So it's a truism that it's not what you know, it's who you know. Right. So, most of the time. So, build a network of people who you know and who know you, and show them your stuff. If you're an artist, have a portfolio, post stuff regularly, put your material out there, send it to people. This is what I'm working on. Right. It's really easy to network today compared to what it was, even 10 years ago. There's just so many ways of putting your material out there on YouTube or on the internet or on LinkedIn. There's art portfolio sites that people trawl through if you're an artist. It's a little bit, if you're a programmer, obviously, you probably want to have a computer science degree. That would be the ideal thing. And, if you want to be a game programmer, work on some games. Do stuff, build a game in your as your spare time hobby at home or at school if you can do it at school. It's a bit harder for people who want to do production and things like that. Most people don't kind of come into the industry doing production. They usually get into it through another way, like they're a programmer who ends up doing it, or they're a designer who ends up doing it, or they're a QA guy. If you're a gamer and you don't really have any kind of engineering or hard sort of art skills, then becoming a QA guy is a good way of getting into the industry, because you can go from there to being a designer or being a producer or something. But I would just network, make your stuff. If you're actually a creator of content of some description, create stuff and show it to people and put it out there. And be respectful of other people's time, but be a little bit pushy. I like it when people, send me things and then ask me what I thought about them, and because if I'm going to hire someone, I'm going to probably hire the guy I remembered, and that's most recently, and that would probably be the most recent person who sent me something that was interesting, right? Or someone I know, I've known for a while, I've been communicating with, right? So that would be the advice I would have for sort of people trying to get in. And if you can afford to, make it, get together with a group of guys or girls and spend a year or two, make something and put it out, because you're going to learn more doing that than anything else. You will learn more by actually building an actual finished product and shipping it than doing anything else. In my opinion. apart from maybe working at a studio for a bit, but you don't have a job, working somewhere else. Do it yourself, and you'll learn. You'll learn so much. There's a really big difference between writing something and actually finishing something. Finishing a product is really hard, and it requires a lot of discipline and focus. And these days, there's so much stuff. I mean, you can go online. Even if you're just a designer, you can go online and find models, and you can use Unreal or Unity and all this free stuff, and you can build a level without having to create any art whatsoever for yourself. You just can steal it from other things, or use other things. So there's no excuse for anyone not doing that. The tools are all there. Programmers have got. You can go online and get game kits that finished games and demos of things that you can just look through the code and figure out how it works. That kind of stuff that didn't exist back when I started. I mean, you could find books, but they were expensive and they weren't very good most of the time. There's a couple of good books, like De Re Atari was a really good book by Chris Crawford, but most of the time, you didn't have that. You had to learn yourself by hacking things. So it's a lot easier these days to create stuff and get it in a game than it ever was. So do stuff, make things.